Welcome to the Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery, where every death had a life and every life had a story. My name is Jenny Johnson.
Hello, and I'm Diane Hartshorn.
And we will get back to our conversation with Joy Giguere in just a moment and her book, Pleasure
Fascinating.
Grounds of Death. But before we do, we just want to remind our listeners that our Beyond the Grave,
Mm.
Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, is fast approaching.
And selling fast. I don't think this is our fourth year. The other 3 years have been selling as quickly as this one has. So we are really excited about it.
I know. We put the tickets on sale a little earlier, I think, this time.
Yeah, a
Because we
little bit
we put it
earlier.
on, at the beginning of August, and we were amazed at how quickly
Hmm.
tickets started to sell. So if you're planning to attend, the event is October 4th and 5th, Evergreen Cemetery in uh, Colorado
Colorado
Springs.
Springs.
I'm telling you, my brain is.
Yeah, it's
This is when we ramp up our whole thing, and we have events going on, and you're wrapping up stuff in the cemetery for the summer, and it's just
right.
nuts.
It's nuts, definitely. But it's a good nut, so
It
we're
is a
not
good nuts.
complaining.
No. So October 4th and 5th, tickets are on sale now. We did change up the activities just a little this year, or the audience size.
Right.
So in previous years, we were doing groups of 20. We've scaled it back to groups of 16. So that also does mean there are fewer tickets
Right.
available. We have the same amount of tours between the two nights, but because we're limiting our size in the groups to 16, we just were trying to give everybody a little more elbow room after some of our feedback from last year. So get those tickets quick. There's a link directly on our website, theordinaryextraordinarycemetery.com. If you click it, it's right at the top when you click into
Right.
our homepage. Or you can get them in the show notes for today's episode and any previous episode in the last couple of weeks, because
Right.
I put it in there. So now we are going to join back with Joy Giguere, and we are going to continue discussing pleasure grounds of death.
I like the fact that it wasn't just sometimes when you get a book on a cemetery, you're just focusing on that one book, or I'm sorry, that one cemetery, you
Mhm.
know, where yours goes into the web of these cemeteries and how this influenced this cemetery, and then that influenced this cemetery, which could come back around to influence that cemetery. It was like just a constant flow of
Mhm.
change. And then of course, as we moved west, things, influences went with, because
Yeah.
everybody wanted to be the fancy kid on the block, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, you've got, the influence of the landscapes on landscaping and how cemetery, the design changes, how the monuments change. And of course, all of us in EGS, we love monuments. But, the real priority for me in all of this, though, was to really dig into the social and cultural dynamics of these
Mhm.
cemeteries. How did the living use and abuse these spaces and
Mhm.
engage with each other as well as with the dead? And as you said, one of the big things, one of the major points that I make is that when it came to race relations and racial divides and divides on along lines of class and sex and things like that, there's no clear-cut boundaries. It's not
Mhm.
a north-south divide. Um, you've got lots of northern cemeteries that either completely barred black burials or they had special black sections that were
Mhm.
established. So, like Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, they had an African American section in like the back corner of the cemetery. Laurel Hill in Philadelphia, sorry, Laurel Hill, but they completely barred the burial of African Americans and poor people. They were explicitly for elite white burials only. You look at a lot of southern cemeteries, and like you look at Richmond, Virginia, for example, Hollywood Cemetery barred black burials. This was an
Mhm.
elite white private rural cemetery. But then the city of Richmond in the following decade established a city-run rural cemetery, Oakwood, that had a section designed specifically for free and enslaved African Americans and for poor people. And African American families were among the first ones to purchase plots at Oakwood. So we've got, even within cemeteries, those that were
Mhm.
very restrictive, while others, you have segregated sections, but everybody within the community had the opportunity to be buried there. I believe it was Elmwood Cemetery in Memphis, Tennessee, where they have an 1870s publication during Reconstruction where they write very proudly about how, before the problems of the Civil War, basically, we were already allowing Black people to be buried in our cemetery. We weren't being forced into it. We already had a Black section. So, like, for a lot of cemeteries, even though they had segregated sections for African Americans, they still regarded themselves as being progressive for the simple fact that they had those sections
Hmm.
Right.
demarcated for the local Black population, or that they had Potter's Fields within the rural cemetery, because, the rural cemetery is supposed to be this picturesque tourist destination where people can see how lovely the landscaping is and how civilized the local city is. And to have a section that's specifically for the poor or for working classes or for racial and ethnic minorities, that's kind of this oddly progressive mark for that city, saying, well, we are we're giving opportunities. We don't just have a Potter's Field hidden away for our Black population, including our free Black population, but they can also be buried in the
Mhm.
rural cemetery, just not where the white folks are.
Right.
Yeah.
They're going to be probably further back, and yeah, but
Exactly. And what's fascinating with those is that for a number of those rural cemeteries, even later on when those cemeteries desegregated, those original African American sections continued to be used by Black families moving forward because that was the historically Black section. So families stayed with families.
mhm.
Exactly.
And you
That
have
way,
burials going into
yeah.
the era where they could purchase lots elsewhere in the cemetery, but because that's where all the Black families were, that's where they stayed.
They would
And
stay
I think
close to family. Yeah.
that was the case at Frankfort Cemetery in Frankfort, Kentucky. And so, we see these patterns of continuity here,
Mhm.
where these were originally segregated sections, but then even post segregation, they continue to be like, this is the traditional Black section of the cemetery. And listening to both of your comments here, I think one of the things that really struck me as I was working on this was how integral the cemetery itself was in reflecting, but also shaping American attitudes towards the dead and relationships with the dead. Because we see that in the post-Civil War period, as the modern funeral industry develops, holding hands with that funeral industry is the cemetery restyling itself as a modern business.
Right.
And when you look at the rural cemeteries that are established from the 1830s through the 1860s, when a family purchased a plot of, say, 200, 300 plus square feet, that was their own private real estate to
Mhm.
do with as they saw fit. And the cemetery trustees were very clear. You own this lot and you do with it what you want. It is your responsibility. This is before perpetual care contracts. So you own it, you put up your monuments, you plant your flowers, you plant your bushes, you plant your trees. And of course, in some places, we see the long-term ramifications of that with trees eating markers and
Right.
monuments. Because families didn't think about, well, what's this little tree going to look like in 100 years?
Right.
But it was up to the family. They cared for those lots. And a lot of times, even before anybody died, they were regularly going to the cemetery and planting flowers and tending it. It was their own little garden.
Mhm.
And people would get really bent out of shape if people messed with their little garden in the cemetery. Like today, folks would go and they'd steal flowers and they'd
Yep.
break things, and people would get really, really upset because it's like, this is my property. And part of the reason why they started putting cast iron and wrought iron fences around their lots was to try and dissuade people from stealing their flowers. And that's even before they put up monuments. But all that stuff was left up to the families.
Right.
And just like, as you said, when someone died, it's the family members. They wash the body, they dress the body, they put it on display in the parlor in the house. They have someone with cabinetry skills fashion the coffin.
Mhm.
The family members and friends, they're the pallbearers. They might hire the local undertaker to rent a hearse that was
Mhm.
drawn by a horse to get them from the house to the cemetery, but that was about it. The role of the undertaker before the Civil War was really minimal. And then we get post-Civil War, and undertakers, they're restyling themselves now that they know the art of embalming. They're restyling themselves as funeral directors.
Mhm.
And they are very strategically trying to get all of that care for the dead outsourced into their hands, into their care. And so we've got like three trends that are taking place in the last years of the 19th century. One, you've got the rise of the funeral industry itself. You have funeral directors that now have their funeral home, their place of business, where they're going to wash the body, embalm the body, sell you a casket, put it on display for the wake. They're going to provide the hearse and do all that other stuff. A second development at the end of the century is that the medical community finally wraps their heads around germ theory. And,
Took them a while.
and the Americans are a bit slow at this. Like the British have already been like, oh yeah, Lister's right. We're good with that. But
Just wash your hands, maybe.
it takes until poor James Garfield dies of horrific sepsis at the
Mhm.
hands of his doctors after getting shot in the back. It was the doctors that killed him, not the assassin's bullet. That the American medical community in 1881 finally starts to go, oh, shoot, maybe Lister had something going there. And so we start to finally see these fundamental changes in the American medical system, but most importantly in the hospital system. Hospitals go from places of horror and
Mhm.
pain and infection and death to these powerhouses, these surgical powerhouses where you can go for healing, but they also transform into these places for end of life care. So
Mhm.
death itself is increasingly being outsourced to the hospital, where you are sick, you are at the end of your life, and you are being placed into the care of strangers. And so as we're bridging into the 20th century, more and more people are dying in hospitals rather than at home in beds surrounded by their loved ones, the traditional deathbed setting. So the care of the dead is getting outsourced to the funeral industry. Death itself, the process of dying, is getting outsourced to the hospital. And then you have the cemeteries that, with a newly styled professional class of superintendents, are trying to wrest control over the cemetery landscape itself, to turn the cemetery into a very modern business model where the superintendent wields total control over landscaping, design, choice of monuments and things like that. And so this is where perpetual care contracts start to enter into the picture, where they make the case to lot holders, hey, what happens when, your family, say, moves away and you
Mhm.
don't have anybody local to take care of the lot anymore? Or if everybody in the family dies out, and again, you no longer have anybody to care for the lot, you can sign this contract and basically pay us money so that we'll take care of it for you. But then it turns into a near requirement. So
Mhm.
the cemeteries have total control over that design, over the care of the lots, and it takes it out of the hands of the individual lot holders. And it sounds a little bit glib to say this, but by the time we get to the end of the 19th century, even with Victorian mourning values, with the black crepe dresses and veils, and the expectations for widows and everything are still in place pretty much until World War One. By the time we get to the end of the 19th century, as far as the relationship with the dead body goes, all you got to do is show up to the funeral,
Yeah.
Mhm.
pay somebody, and show up. Pick a monument that the cemetery itself finds inoffensive. And that's kind of the extent of the relationship between the living and the dead. Now, this is not a universal thing that happens, though. You look at the rural parts of the country, you look at
Right.
the still kind of frontier parts of the country, a lot of ethnic communities, you still see a long-term continuity in terms of care for the dead at home, dying at home because of mistrust directed towards the medical community.
Right.
So it's not just like we go from at home to everything is outsourced all at once. It's a more gradual procession. But when you look at, say, the kinds of communities that were establishing rural cemeteries in the 1830s, these are middle class and elite white professional families.
Right.
And they are the driving force behind establishing rural cemeteries in the 30s and 40s. And they're the first ones to really jump on the funeral industry bandwagon and taking advantage of modern hospital systems and signing perpetual care contracts. So they're, the trailblazers in essentially blocking themselves out of their own care for the dead.
Right.
And for other communities in the country, it's simply a staggered progression. It eventually bleeds into practically everywhere. And what we're seeing in this last quarter century is a major cultural pushback to all of that, where we see modern progressive funeral professionals that are encouraging, death itself is not a crisis. You don't have to have the body removed from the home immediately. You can stay with the body. You can wash the body. You can care for the body at home. You can display the body at home. You can have a green burial. You can have, you can have the family deeply involved in this. And I think that this is a movement that has been gaining steam because people are feeling this general, emptiness.
Right.
That I want to say the pinnacle of the modern American way of death was probably the 1940s to the 1970s. So Jessica Mitford wrote The American Way of Death in the 1960s.
Okay.
Telling people this is what the American funeral industry is like. And the funeral industry itself hated her for it. But it showed how basically it had become part of American consumer society, that it was all about consumption and spending money, and it was kind of like part of that like soulless American consumerism and materialism. The more you spend on a fancy casket, the more you loved your spouse or your child or what have you. That it was all about market manipulation and manipulation of, the consumer, who is also in a compromised emotional state because they are grieving. And
well, I think it also sterilized the grieving process too, to a lot of, because you took away the family being involved. And so it becomes a very sterilized thing. So yes, you're grieving the loss of this person, but because you're not personally getting them ready for burial, and you're not personally oh no, mine is running around like crazy right now, but it took away all that personalization, which I think for a lot of people going through grief, that was the first step to handling sometimes their grief, was having that time with their deceased loved ones, and that all got taken away. So then you did, and everybody handles grief differently, but I think when you take away, you depersonalize it like that, I think for a lot of people, then they didn't know how to handle the next step in the grieving process. Like what happens next now? Because now they just took the body and went away, and now what? I clean out their personal effects maybe, and that kind of thing. So I think, like you said, I think now we're kind of going backwards in saying, well, let's bring it back to a more personal level and make sure that we're doing something meaningful with our dead once they're gone, and whatever that looks like for each individual family and person and stuff.
Well, and I think in depersonalizing death and the relationship between the living and the dead, it also increasingly made discussions about death taboo. And there's an increasing number of studies that have pointed out how, for 20th century United States, Americans are terrified of death. They don't like to talk about it. They don't like to think about it. You look at even just 100 years ago in the 1920s, infant and child mortality rates were still so incredibly high because it was the pre-penicillin era. You have, unpasteurized milk and all this other stuff. You still have so many different killers of children under 5 that families, they were still grappling with the reality that they were losing multiple children, that it wasn't if we're going to lose a child, but how many are we going to lose? how many can we manage to get to survive to adulthood, to we get to the post-World War II era, and increasingly the death of a child becomes a catastrophe. It becomes a tragedy of immense proportions, which is not to say that families beforehand did not feel deeply and grieve deeply for the loss of children, but it was part of their everyday lived experience. And you look at the American social landscape today, and if a child dies, everybody hears about it. And this
True.
is an absolutely devastating event that can crush entire families, if they lose a child. And it's not part of our everyday reality. And one of the things that I point out, though, in the book is that in many ways, since the turn of the 21st century, death as an everyday occurrence has increasingly become a part of our reality, kind of like the 19th century again, but in different ways. So we have mass violence through gun shootings, for example. We have literally just lived through a massive worldwide pandemic that
Yep.
killed
A lot of people.
well over 1 million Americans.
Mhm.
And when you look at the figures, I remember when COVID began, and I made comparisons with the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 to 1920. Now, in 2 years, Spanish flu killed 675,000 Americans. In 2 years, COVID killed over 1 million Americans. And when you look at the mortality rates for those two diseases, they're pretty equivalent to each other.
Mhm.
So we are living today in an environment where we have mass shootings, we have pandemic disease, we have diseases that are killing people that were not killing people a century ago because of lifestyle differences. So we have heart disease, we have diabetes, we have cancer, because people are living more extended lives, and so they're living longer and having greater opportunities to have chronic diseases that are eventually going to kill them, like this. And
Right.
so I think, as 21st century Americans, we do have a more intimate relationship with death occurring in daily and sometimes unexpected ways, that we have a greater kinship in that respect with the Victorians than mid 20th century Americans do. And so we have more people that are talking about death, that are talking about, well, what do I want to have done with my body when I do die? As you know, Jenny, I lost my father last month, and we were not expecting that at all.
Right. It was
It came out of
unexpected.
it was unexpected. It was very sudden. And when I went home, we were confronted with, what are we going to do with Dad? And my mother and I, we had a conversation. She says, Jerry and I never talked about
Mhm.
this. We never had the conversation of what we planned on having done when we died. And it just so happened that when they were visiting me in Pennsylvania in May, that my dad and I were driving to campus. I was going to take him to our spring commencement, and he actually struck up the conversation saying, "So, in your professional opinion, what do you think of all different ways? Like, what do you think of like embalming and caskets and cremation and all these other things?" And so I basically gave him the litany of like, okay, here are all the options, here are the pros and cons, and I gave him my frank opinions, and I said, "So what do you think you want to have done, Dad?" And he's like, I think I want to be cremated. I'm leaning towards cremation. It's like, okay. And he said, well, what do you want to have done? And I said, I'd like to ideally have a green burial someday. So we were having it just as like a conversation. And
Right.
he's like, study all this stuff. So tell me what you think. And when I went home, and my mom was so concerned because she's like, we never had this conversation. And I said, guess what? We did. And I was so thankful, because for whatever reason, he felt comfortable having that conversation with me, that he
Yeah.
might have shied away from it with my mom. They didn't like dealing with end of life stuff. It took them a long time to come to grips with, oh, we need to have wills drawn. They didn't want to do those things because they come from that 20th century mindset.
I was gonna say they're from that generation of
Right.
people
Right.
where you didn't do it anymore.
And yet my father, here we are in the car just having a very casual conversation about what to do with dead bodies and what are my opinions and what does he want. And we were so thankful that when I went home, I could say, I know what Dad wanted. I know what he wanted. So that we could walk into the funeral home with this sense of confidence that we didn't have to try and decide, oh, are we going to do embalming? Are we going to do the casket? How much are we going to spend? What are we going to do here? And we could walk in and say, we're doing a cremation. And that was just, end of discussion. And that it was one less thing to have to not only hem and haw about and debate what's the proper thing to do, but we knew exactly, he had articulated it to me. He had voiced it out loud. And I think you go back, 40, 50 years, and most Americans were not having that conversation. They were letting funeral industry professionals guide them in those choices. And there were certain factors that would make people choose one thing over the other, usually cost. Cremation's a lot cheaper, but the industry professionals are very adept at saying, well, this is probably a more respectful option, or if you're really dedicated to cremation, here are the urn selections of varying price points and so on and so forth. And today we're living in a time period where I think more of us feel comfortable being able to have these conversations, and we see that reflected in the great variety of burial options and funeral options, of family involvement, of these historic rural cemeteries modifying their services to the public. And that's one thing that, these cemeteries have done over the years. They have marketed themselves to the public to meet public demand.
Yeah.
Oh, you want rolling hills? We'll give you rolling hills. Oh, on expansive lawns? Okay, here's an expansive lawn section.
Yeah.
Yep.
They're very good at modifying themselves to meet the needs and the desires and the changing winds of public opinion about death and care for the dead. What are we supposed to do with them, and what kinds of monuments are we supposed to put up? And I think in a way this is a good development that's taken place in the 21st century. I like the trends that I'm seeing right now because it's not sterile and it's not soulless, but that you can see people really coming to grips with what is a reality for everybody.
Right. I mean, everybody, eventually we all will die and something has to happen to us afterwards.
But institutionally, and system-wide across the country, we could still see that there's a lot of catching up to do. When I teach my history of death and mourning class with my students, I say, in many ways, okay, the Victorians were certainly over the top in a lot of ways, but I think
which we love about them.
one of the things that they did right was they, as a cultural moment, they recognized the importance of acknowledging and respecting grief, and that grief does not have temporal boundaries.
Right.
And you look at the way that bereavement is dealt with today, both in the United States and globally. And there are a number of countries that actually have like nationwide mandated bereavement leave for people when somebody dies. And it's all like, if it was a parent, a spouse, a child,
right. The relationship.
Basically a very close familial relationship determines how much time you get off. But you actually get state mandated bereavement leave in some countries, and then you might get more from employers. In the United States, there is no federal mandated bereavement leave. None of the states have state mandated bereavement leave. It's entirely left up to employers, and most companies offer the equivalent of a weekend, 2 to 3 days. Some places that might be more generous, you might get 5, but you need to eat into your vacation time.
Right.
And that's not a bereavement policy. That's a disposal policy. It gives you enough time to have a funeral and get the body buried or put in a columbarium or what have you. It does not acknowledge the process of bereavement and grief that is very natural that people have to go through. And so that's one thing I really admire about the Victorians. Now, I think they were a little bit they were a bit hard-fisted about it, where like telling widows like you have to seclude yourselves from society for a year
And wear black and all the things. Yeah.
and all the things. But at the same time, they still recognize like you can't put a timestamp on grief.
Right.
It lasts however long it lasts. And if it lasts the rest of your life, then we acknowledge that and we respect that. And you have those odd social requirements, like widows had to wear some aspect of black for the rest of their lives, even if they remarried, to show their widowhood status.
Right.
But in a way, it was a visual marker so that the rest of the public knew this person had gone through this experience. And that has a lasting impression. And that just doesn't go away in the span of a weekend or a week or a month or a year.
No. And I think the other thing Victorians did well with that is their literature. Depending on the time period we're talking about, novels weren't necessarily encouraged for a lot of people until later. But if you read a lot of that classic literature, death was a theme within the stories almost all the time. I get so frustrated, and this is coming from somebody who just likes classic literature, but one of my favorite books as a kid was A Little Princess. Spoiler alert, if you've never read it, her father dies. Every movie version that's ever been made since then, he lives. There's a surprise, he's alive. And I hate it. And as an adult, and I know why I hate it now. I hated it before because it didn't follow the book. And I was like, dude, could we follow the book? But now when I think more about it as an adult, and especially as somebody who's been involved with cemeteries and stuff, Sarah had to go through this grieving process of losing her dad, who she was very close to. And in her case, the only parent she knew, because her mother died when she was a baby and she never had that relationship. And it showed how a child could go through the process of death and losing a parent. And of course, she's about 11 or 12 years old at the time that this all happens. And yes, the book still has a happy ending. By the way, Hollywood still has a happy ending. It just doesn't involve her dad. But I get frustrated that our literature over time, just like the sterilization of the death industry started to sterilize that stuff. We wanted to make things safer for children, especially children's literature. And so we take out the death and we take out the scary stuff and we take all of that away. And then when it happens, we don't know how, children didn't know how to react. I think, again, like you said, it's turning around because of things that have happened to us culturally now. But for a long time, we wanted to protect kids from that stuff. There was that, once the death industry started to evolve, you also see it evolving in literature and in movies. And what do we allow our children to see and experience when they're little? And don't give kids especially credit for being able to handle more than we think they can, because most kids can. We're just not giving them the opportunity. And when you take it out of the things that they read and the things, not that I'm saying I want them to go out and watch all the violent movies out there or anything like that. No, it's totally not what I'm saying. But I am saying that when you remove all of that from the literature, you remove that from things that they're watching, again, the discussions don't happen. And then when something does happen and they lose a loved one, the kids are like, I don't understand this process. Whereas Victorian children were used to it. It was in their literature. It happened in their families all the time. They attended funerals all the time. Like, it wasn't kept a secret, and it wasn't something to be, I'll take that back. They were scared of it, but it was different than the type of fear that I think happens to a more modern people.
We're disconnected.
Yeah.
Where the little princess, right? Probably was written for the very purpose of helping a child who may have lost a parent. They had a purpose behind that story besides just her father dying. I'm sure that was the reason behind that book. Well,
and there's so many other instances, though, where that happened in literature, where somebody's dying and Frankenstein is a perfect example. There's a lot of people that die in Frankenstein, unfortunately, in very tragic circumstances in this case, because you have a monster that's going around and killing them. But which is a little bit different. It's like the first serial killer thing going on here with this monster. But it, again, the idea of death, and you have to think about when Mary Shelley wrote her book, she had experienced some death. Her mother died when she was an infant, so she never knew her mother. And then shortly after her book was published, she lost a bunch of loved ones to suicide and other very tragic circumstances. But, and in her later writings, she talks about all of that and how it affected her. But you can see how she was like, the people around her, her husband and everything, would try and pull her out of it because they knew that this grief was going to hit and hit hard. And we moved away from that with the change in how we view cemeteries and death and everything. So I think your book does a lovely job of showing how those changes have happened over the centuries. And I love the fact that when we think about it in a more modern sense, hopefully it helps people go backwards just a little bit so that death is not the scary death stuff that it is, and that we will talk about it and we will plan for where we're going to put our loved ones going forward and what we want to see a modern cemetery evolve into now from what it evolved into here. So it was phenomenal. This, like I said, Joy, you did an excellent job. Everybody can read this book. So if you're a scholar or not a scholar, but you want to know more about cemeteries, definitely pick up this book because you will learn so much. This book is, it hasn't actually made it onto the cemetery bookshelf yet because I keep going back to it, but eventually it'll be over there.
I have to say, I absolutely loved working with the University of Michigan Press. They were absolutely fabulous through this entire process. And one of my favorite things that they did, they really want people to access the book and to read the book. And so they did a simultaneous print of the book in hardcover, paperback, and ebook.
Oh, I love that.
A lot of places we're going to do the hardcover and see how it does.
Oh,
but
yeah.
with a lot of university presses, the hardcover is going to be 75, 80, 90 bucks. And the hardcover of Pleasure Grounds is $80. But the paperback is $24.95 and the ebook is $24.95. And they said right from the start, they're like, we want people to read this. We don't just want university libraries purchasing it, but the general public should be able to buy this. And you can't expect the general public to spend $80 on a book, even one as fabulous as mine. And sorry.
Although I'm pretty sure the hard copy is going to make it in eventually. So
but I have to say that University of Michigan, they've been absolutely delightful. And so for anybody who's interested, they can order it directly from the University of Michigan website. They can also go through Amazon, Barnes and Noble. There's a bunch of online booksellers that have been showing it as available. So, I mean, this is widely available, and I'm just excited to have it out in the world and for people to be able to read it and know more about rural cemeteries and why they're important, not just in the 19th century, but even for us today. And to have this as a resource. And I'm just so thrilled for this work that I've wanted to have exist for so long that it exists.
I'm so excited. And so we'll link those links in the show notes, folks. So if you want to order the book, check out the show notes, find one of the links, whichever one you want to support, get your book ordered. I got mine directly through your publisher, which was great because it came really fast. And then I was able to immediately, I mean, I had the e-version of it too, but this was so much better having the pages to
because you can't
go through and
bookmark and
I'm a physical book, but I do books and stuff too, but I really like having a physical copy of a book, especially if I'm going to go back to it from time again. So, and I think for anybody who, I'll see questions in different groups and stuff online about things related to cemeteries or whatever, you will get a lot of answers through Joy's book because she goes into so much detail about so many things. So those questions that come up periodically where somebody's like, well, why would you do this? Or why would this be a thing? I bet you're going to find that answer in here because I found a lot of answers to things that I had kind of wondered about before and never, or had thought about in passing, but didn't make connections the way you made the connections.
That's what I like.
I love connections. So this is definitely check it out. Joy, thank you so much for taking time out tonight to chat with us. Of course, if you ever want to be on the show again, we'll more than happy to have you with one of your other topics.
I love being on your show. This is great.
We love having you.
And did you have any lingering questions or anything that we didn't already talk about
I
tonight?
don't think so. I think we picked up most everything,
Yeah.
and
All
I think
right.
we got a good overview of what's in the book. I mean, obviously there's way more detail about stuff than some of the things we talked about, but it's
We didn't even get into the Civil War, all of
I know we kind of
the poor
alluded to it a little,
behaviors
and
of
then
people.
but that whole, yeah, this, if especially for those folks who are dealing with Civil War cemeteries right now. I know we have some listeners and stuff that are working in some of the old, like specifically Civil War related cemeteries. This is a great way to learn some information that may be very helpful to you in your restoration work and your going forward, and how to track things and keep records for things. If you're trying to build an archive that maybe didn't exist, this is a great way to think about how to build that archive so that everybody gets the respect that they should have that's in these cemeteries. So without being, yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
So thanks,
Yeah,
Joy.
it's not only a book on book on the history of the rural cemeteries, but it is really a book on American history as well too. So it's not,
It's the American story.
yeah, yeah,
In a lot of
exactly.
ways.
Yeah.
A lot. And that's just that's kind of the fun thing about, I don't know if fun's the right word. It's the interesting thing about the American story, because it's depending on where you come from and what your background is like, it's different for each of us. So this
Yeah.
is a great way to get a good perspective of the fact that
Definitely.
we don't always remember that it's different for everybody depending on your background and where you come from, but it really is. And this is a great way to think about it when you look at it through the eyes of the cemeteries.
That was good. The eyes of
Thank you.
the
Thank you so much.
We thank you for taking time to join us today for this ordinary, extraordinary chat. To learn more about today's discussion, please visit our website, theordinaryextraordinarycemetery.com, where you will find additional links in our show notes. And if you're watching us on YouTube, be sure to give us a like and subscribe to our channel, The Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery Podcast. This really helps makes us more visible to others on YouTube who may also enjoy our podcast.
And please don't forget to visit us on social media, where we share all kinds of cemetery photos, quotes, tidbits, and more. We are on Facebook and Instagram at Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery, and on X at OrdExtraCem. So OrdExtraCem. If you enjoyed this or any of our episodes, please consider leaving a 5-star review and a comment on Apple's podcast, Spotify, or directly on our website. You can also leave those same comments on YouTube. Your positive reviews and enthusiasm for our show help others who love cemeteries and history to discover us and all of our ordinary, extraordinary stories. And if you're feeling extra generous and want to help support the podcast in a financial way, you can now buy Diane and I a cup of coffee, either through YouTube or on our website. Simply click on the coffee cup icon and it will allow you to make a donation.
Until we meet again.